Globalization over the past few decades has meant trade, finance, and people flowing across borders, building an ever more interconnected economic order. But as the COVID-19 pandemic interrupts much of what once moved seamlessly around the globe, has it exposed weakness in that system, such that it may now never be the same? Well, let's ask. In Newton, Massachusetts via Skype, Daniel Drezner. He is a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and the author of The Toddler-in-Chief, What Donald Trump Teaches Us About the Modern Presidency. In Baynesville, Ontario, on the banks of the St. Lawrence River near Cornwall and via FaceTime, there's Sean Speer, professor at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and a senior fellow for fiscal policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And here in the provincial capital via Skype from her home, there's Janice Stein, the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management and founding director of the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And it's great to welcome you three back to our airwaves here on TVO. I want to just set up our conversation by reading three quick quotes that have been in the media over the past few months, which are past actually a few weeks, which kind of got us thinking about this issue about COVID-19's effect on globalization. The first was in the New York Times a few weeks ago. As surgical masks become desperately desired items, as schools from Japan to Ireland sit closed, as airlines scrap flights, trade shows are canceled, and stock markets plunge, annihilating trillions of dollars in wealth, the panic seems likely to alter the contours of globalization. Then we've got Gary Schilling, a New Jersey based financial consultant, writing 2 weeks ago, the coronavirus's depressing effects on the global economy and disruptions of supply chains is no doubt driving the last nail into the coffin of the globalists. And then Zachary Karabell, the New York-born author and columnist and investor, wrote about a week and a half ago, the months ahead will feel like the presumptive end of an era of globalization, and it may be the end of globalization's first phase with its heady optimism and corresponding ideological and economic backlash. But there will be a next phase, one less rosy-eyed and less sour as well. Okay, that's some of the early verdict here. Daniel, get us started. What has the coronavirus revealed, in your view, about globalization?
I think that the most important takeaway is that we have to be aware of our own biases in terms of how we think about globalization. And the most important thing about the coronavirus is that the most pronounced impact it has had is not necessarily on the movement of goods or the movement of services, but rather obviously the movement of people. That clearly this virus has spread in no small part because we live in a globalized world, because people were able to travel from Wuhan to everywhere else. And so in some ways, the most immediate responses have been to restrict the flow of people. And so this is something we feel very keenly, and I'm not surprised, therefore, that many analysts are extrapolating from that to say globalization as we know it has ended. But it is worth noting that with some important exceptions, goods and services haven't been stopped. And in some ways, the global supply chains and distribution networks haven't necessarily been shut down. There's no denying that because this crisis started in China, that certainly had ripple effects. But if you see China starting to get back in terms of production, I don't think it's going to be the case that people are going to stop importing Chinese goods. There might be longer term effects of this in terms of thinking about the globalized supply chain. But I think the primary takeaway is that people might be exaggerating from the effect on the movements of people to the movement of other aspects that are important to economic globalization.
Janice, how about your take on what this crisis has done to our view of globalization?
Well, I think it's had a real impact, Steve. We were in a period of receding globalization for the previous decade, which many of us didn't really talk about. But global trade was declining as a proportion of the global economy. Borders were thickening. So the coronavirus comes at a time when globalization was in retreat anyway. And that's why I think the impact will be more long-lasting. We're not going to get a V-shaped recovery and back to globalization on steroids. That's just not it's not on the table. I think the second big point, Dan put the first one on the table. Boy, people moving around the world is a risk as well as an advantage because you carry disease with you. But the second big one, and this is, I think, permeated public consciousness, global supply chains that concentrate the making of important medicines, important medical equipment outside your own borders is a risk when a crisis develops.
Sean, you want to weigh in on that?
I'm inclined to agree with Janice. I think that this particular crisis is perfectly designed for those who want to push back against the trends of globalization, that it's originated elsewhere, that it's exposed the fragility of global supply chains, that it's brought into question the importance of maintaining domestic productive capacity in strategic sectors. All of these aspects of the current crisis, I think, will arm those who want to relitigate globalization. And in fact, we're already seeing that in Washington. Republican senators, including Marco Rubio from Florida, Tom Cotton from Arkansas, and Josh Hawley from Missouri, were advancing the case against hyperglobalization before the crisis. And I think the long-term effect of this, the current moment we find ourselves in, is that those senators and others who want to challenge globalization will be armed with a whole new set of arguments that I think ultimately will have an effect on globalization as we've come to think about it for the past quarter century or so.
Daniel, before the COVID crisis really took hold of our lives, how would you have characterized the level of confidence around globalization as the right approach to essentially make progress in the world?
So I don't disagree with Janice's point that in some ways, even before COVID, you'd seen pushback in terms of the sort of, peak era of what would be called hyperglobalization. Certainly the Trump administration had tried to prosecute multiple trade wars with China, with Europe. Even the renegotiation of NAFTA led to a less liberal trade agreement in the end. So there's no denying that there had been incipient trends to push away from globalization. But I would argue sort of two counterpoints to that. The first is that much like the pre-World War I era, technological innovation was nonetheless shifting towards greater integration anyway. The very fact that we can have this conversation right now, despite all of us being housebound, demonstrates the ways in which it's still possible to cross borders, even if you're not leaving your living room. The second thing is that for all of Trump's push on railing against globalization, railing against immigration, it's worth noting that he was actually losing the argument with the American people. That if you take a look at public opinion polling in the United States since Trump has been elected, despite the fact that he had hammered, the perils of free trade, the perils of immigration, Americans had actually become more supportive of both of these things during the same time that Trump had been president. So without in any way denying that he had political power, it was not obvious that he had won the argument. And so it'll be interesting to see going forward whether this event will arm those like Tom Cotton or Marco Rubio that says, it turns out we got globalization wrong. And I think in some ways what you have to separate is perspectives about globalization and perspectives about China, because that's a different debate. And while it will obviously have significant effects on the global economy, you can simultaneously say, well, it turns out we've clearly been too reliant on China for parts of our global supply chain. But I don't think that means there's going to be home shoring of this stuff. It just means you're going to see factories and supply chains relocating to places like Bangladesh and India and Vietnam rather than being in China.
Janice, do you think globalization was in retreat to a certain extent before the COVID-19 crisis hit?
Oh, the evidence is really strong for this, Steve, that it was in retreat ever since the global financial crisis in 2009, really. So many measures, trade, global trade as a proportion of global GDP has been declining really in quite remarkable ways. And that's one of the most important indicators. So if you look at trade and financial investments and offshore investment, that's been declining too. The other side is what Dan talked about, though. We're so digitally connected now, and that's, if you look at digital flows as opposed to currency flows, digital flows have gone the other way. So we have two competing stories happening at the same time here. I think the rubber hits the road for people. This is the first crisis in living memory for many people when governments are unable to provide critical civilian equipment that's necessary to save lives. That's not a passing moment in the politics of most countries. And in that sense, I'm not sure, Dan, that if you move those supply chains out of China to India, India's under lockdown right now. We would be no better off at getting the equipment. And people are looking at this and they're saying, no ventilators, no masks, no gowns. And you have cottage industries springing up with 3D printers that are now manufacturing this kind of critical equipment, which all governments were told, every single one of them, they needed, but they didn't do anything about it. I think there is a no-go back scenario in part as a result of COVID.
The only thing I would add, Steve, is I take Dan's point about the role of technology and the digitization of our economy. But there's another side of that story as well. I think there's compelling evidence that the intangibles economy, an economy rooted in intellectual property, data, and so on, is hyper competitive. There's been considerable research conducted that shows that it operates in a zero-sum way, in a way that the typical goods producing economy doesn't. And so I think in a way that's been propelling the emphasis on national developmentism, a focus on building domestic capacities to compete and participate in the digital economy, and that these technologies also have dual purposes. That is to say that they can function both in the consumer space, but also having national security or military-related purposes will, I think, serve to reinforce this trend towards a greater emphasis on a national point of view when it comes to economic policy, and the net effect will, I think, push globalization in the direction that Janice is describing.
Can I jump in there for 1 minute?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Janice.
To what Sean just said. You know, one of the interesting things we've seen over the last few years is what we call localization. So most people would be familiar with the argument, we want our data stored in our own countries, on servers in our own country. So even though we have global digital technology, we're actually seeing countries draw borders around their digital assets, as well as around real goods and services in ways that were not happening even 5 years ago. And this all preceded COVID, frankly.
In which case, let me put this to Daniel, which is for those, particularly in your country, who want stronger borders, who want increased trade protection, who want that wall built, as we well remember, do you think the coronavirus crisis has really boosted their arguments?
I mean, you can argue at sort of an almost primal level, the answer would seem to be yes, right? I mean, you know, Donald Trump and his supporters have basically made ran for office in 2016 and have governed along the lines of, if there is any foreign threat, the response to this is just to build a wall to protect us from it. And so there is no denying that there would be a way in which this would be potentially a resonant argument, except if you actually, scratch even just the slightest bit below the surface, it becomes problematic. Among other things, the coronavirus came to the United States because of people traveling to China, not because of people traveling to Mexico, for example. And indeed, in some ways, you could argue the Mexicans should be more grateful for the wall being built if it's built, rather than the Americans, because it keeps the coronavirus out from Mexico, given the much wider amount of infection in the United States. I will say this, that there are ways in which the 2020 election in the United States is going to be a referendum on exactly how we're supposed to deal with these kinds of threats. And
go ahead.
The one other thing I would want to say, to push back a little bit on Janice and Sean, it's not that I disagree with what they're saying, and I can see a way in which that position might be taken. But the analogy I would make would in some ways be to the OPEC oil shocks of the 1970s, which also demonstrated in some ways the ways in which the developed world was dependent upon vital imports from other countries. Now, this did have longer term effects. It led to increases in energy conservation. It led to the creation of strategic petroleum reserves. What it did not do, however, was stop us from importing things from other countries. And so I suspect the response you would see is not so much going to be home shoring, but rather the generation of larger strategic reserves and far more resilient supply chains, which doesn't mean they're necessarily all going to be national. It means they're going to be more diversified.
Janice, you well know the historian Yuval Noah Harari, who has written that this crisis has essentially provided the world with a real fork in the road. It's either nationalist isolation or global solidarity. And I wonder if you see it as that kind of stark choice as well.
No, I think that's, those are two. That's the kind of black and white thinking, frankly, Steve. That's not useful. As we think our way through the world we're going into when this epidemic loses its grip on us, you can have, as Dan just said, and economists like Danny Roderick have been writing about this again for several years now. You can have governments engaging in industrial strategies, for example, designed to build strategic stockpiles, to be able to build enough of a manufacturing capacity. And that takes time and is expensive and it's hard. That surges capacity in these kinds of crises, because I doubt this is the last one we're going to have. At the same time as you have trade across borders in non-essential goods that continues to flow in much the same way that it has in the past. So what we're going to see, I hope, coming out of this is a much more targeted strategic focus by governments on what they need to do, what kind of capacity they need to build, store, and make resilient, as Dan just said, at the same time as they take advantage of the economies of scale in global trade. So we're going to live in...
Yeah, Sean, go ahead. Pick up on that. I can see you want to.
Yeah, pardon me, Janice. I agree. I think that for the past several years, we have, for all intents and purposes, let markets make those choices about what we produce domestically, about where we source inputs and outputs around the world. And I think one of the outcomes of this experience, and as Janice and Dan have both said, one that was already building intellectual and political momentum, will be, I think, an assertion of national governments when it comes to strategic parts of the economy, making deliberate, intentional policy choices to build capacity, particularly in and around products that have relevance in the context of a pandemic. But I think even more fundamentally, Orrin Cass, someone who's served as director of domestic policy in the Mitt Romney campaign, was a guest on this show, as you know, Steve. And he's liked to say in recent months that there's a difference between potato chips and computer chips. And I think henceforth, national governments will assert themselves in shaping the economic context within their borders and ensuring that domestic production capacities are there in strategic parts of the economy.
Well, let me put that notion to Dan, because, of course, everybody's favorite little device that they keep in their pockets, the Apple iPhone, is not actually made in one place. They, Apple works with 43 different, works with suppliers in 43 different countries in order to build that thing. And one wonders whether, if we're becoming less globalized and putting up actual or metaphorical walls, whether or not these products are going to be, resilient enough to withstand whatever's coming down the pipe. What do you think?
So I think two things. The first is that the very fact that you talk about the need for iPhones and so on and so forth does give rise to, there are intellectual arguments out there that warn against the creation of economic networks that are in which key hubs are located in China. My colleagues Henry Farrell and Abe Newman, for example, have talked a lot about the concept of weaponized interdependence. And so this is why, even before the coronavirus, you had concerns about, let's say, Huawei's role in the development of 5G networks and so forth. So it'll be interesting to see, even regardless of the pandemic, whether there are sectors of the economy that are that are viewed by governments as potentially vulnerable to this kind of weaponized interdependence? And then do you see, efforts in terms of segmentation? Now, that said, I would say two other reminders, however, cautionary notes. First, the very fact that the United States has actually been relatively unsuccessful in getting allied governments to give up on Huawei, despite what is a decent case to be made that it will allow China to engage in massive surveillance of key parts of the Western economy, suggests that this is not going to be an easy sale to make. And also, the other thing to consider is that even if national governments want to do this, it's not going to be easy unless they get buy-in from corporations. And there's a reason why corporations are in China in the first place, which is they want to access that market, and it's because they believe they're maximizing profits by doing so. So it is going to be interesting to see whether national governments can potentially implement these tools, but also have to deal with what will probably be furious lobbying from these corporations that rely the most on these globalized supply chains.
Yeah.
Janice, do you think the world needs to rethink China as the sort of de facto global manufacturing hub?
Well, that, Steve, was starting before COVID also. So every single thing we talked about today, COVID accelerates. But those conversations were going on before. And there has been a 3-year discussion about Huawei. And that's, in this country, our government has yet to make a decision about it. And Dan, part of the reason I think the United States has been not successful is the way the case has been made and the people that are making the case. So I wouldn't draw too much inference from that, frankly. But what's so interesting, and here's where I think the game will change. People, all of a sudden, in every daily newspaper is a story that virtually every antibiotic, critical parts of it, are made in China. And that strikes home. That's a much easier argument to make to publics than it is than to talk about Huawei building 5G infrastructure, which is remote and people don't really understand. And so if they think about a situation where that supply chain is broken for any reason, that's a far more alarming prospect politically than the kind of debates we've had before COVID. And that's really where I see the game change. Now, here's where I agree with Dan. How easy is it to onshore that and to build secure supply lines? That is really tough. It takes a long time. And if you don't believe me, read the stories that are now coming out in great American newspapers about why the stockpile of ventilators is as low as it is in the United States, despite experts saying over and over and over, we need this, and 3 administrations trying to work with the private sector to get those ventilators stockpiled. This is just hard to do.
Well, Dan, I should put this quote to you from U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who said that if companies do leave China, it will help accelerate the return of jobs to North America. That's his view. Do you think he's right about that?
No, he's not right at all. I'm sorry, there's just no other way he's right about that. And furthermore, by the way, you've seen that play out in how firms have reacted to the trade wars of between 2018 and the Phase 1 trade deal, which is, first of all, most U.S. firms surveyed about this in China had kept their production facilities within China. They actually hadn't moved. And of the, I think, 20% of them that had moved, a very small fraction of them had taken those production facilities and brought them back home. What they had mostly done was relocate them to other low-wage countries. And so, this might be, I don't doubt that this will cause some mild, trend towards homeshoring. But again, there's a difference between diversifying your supply chains and potentially bringing them home.
Yeah, that's a really big point, Steve. Can we diversify supply chains? So should we be dependent on a single country to provide a critical component of antibiotics? Or should we have 4 suppliers spread out in 5 or 6 different countries? Now, again, that's easy to say, it's hard to orchestrate, and it's hard to do. And just to add on to what Dan and Sean have said here, where's the move out of China? It's at the low end of the wage scale. And that move has happened really because the cost of Chinese labor has grown. Many of the really critical things that we need in Canada right now, that New York City needs and that Detroit needs, are not at the low end of the wage scale. They're actually made by higher skilled workers, where frankly China remains very, very, very competitive in global supply chains.
I note that the surgical masks that everybody needs are being made in China, and in fact, even though this virus started in China, I note that our provinces, our country, American states, and so on are looking to China to try to get some masks over there. But that's a long way from ventilators, isn't it? Sean, go ahead. We got 2 minutes to go.
That this conversation, in effect, is if not globalization, what? And I think that's highly relevant for a Canadian audience. Because of the size of our market, because of the structure of our economy, the question is if the world is going to be moving in a nationalistic direction, if we're going to see a return of industrial policy in the United States and other market economies, Canada is going to have to think strategically. Because of our lack of scale, there'll be limits on how much productive capacity we have here and where we can identify comparative advantages. I think we've been talking about whether this amounts to an end of globalization. In a way, at the domestic level, this amounts to the end of the ethos of the Macdonald Royal Commission, which came about in the mid-'80s and really shaped economic policy thinking in Canada. We've had governments across the political spectrum basically agree with an economic program that consists of low competitive taxation, sound public finances, liberalized trade, privatization, deregulation, and so on. And it seems to me, as much as we may be ending an era of globalization, I think we're ending an era of McDonaldism. And it will be up to scholars, political actors, and others to begin to shape how Canada can navigate in this new evolving world of I think, rising economic nationalism.
I remember well, 35 years ago, the late, great Donald MacDonald saying we need to take a leap of faith on free trade, and you're quite right. That was the beginning of the era, and maybe we're now at the end of the first chapter. We'll see about whether it's the end of the era. Daniel Drezner, Janice Stein, Sean Speer, it's really good of all of you to join us here on TVO tonight. Thanks so much, and it's great to see you all again. Hang in there and be safe, okay, guys?
You too, everybody.
Thank you.
Well.
Same.
Thanks so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.